Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first, what is this, fourth Monday? Fourth Monday of the academic year. It's my privilege to introduce Dr. Jason Buell, who is today's speaker. He is an associate professor of communication. His research engages film and media studies, and he is particularly interested in the ways that sociopolitical power operates in and around media representations. His current book project, co-written with horror author Sally, is it Parlier? From North Carolina State University, applies an eco-critical lens to horror cinema to examine the ways that horror is used to make sense of the relationships between humans and our non-human environments. Today's talk will push Fredric Jameson's dictum to always historicize to absurd lengths by examining what Stone Age cave paintings can tell us about horror film today, and vice versa. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Jason Buell.
First, thank you all so much for being here. I know especially this time of the year, you've got a million other things you could be doing, so I appreciate that you're spending some time with us here to think about cave art and film. This project is admittedly a bit of a provocation, but I hope you will find it to be one with some substance behind it. As Dr. Templeton mentioned, this is kind of going to give you an overview with a couple of little stops along the way of the argument that we're kind of working on in our book project called Now is the Time of Monsters, imagining the late Anthropocene in horror cinema. And as a way of starting, we'll dig right into some cave art. So I just got back from being on sabbatical for a year. One of the things I was able to do on that sabbatical was travel to France. And one of the things I was able to do while traveling to France was visit some cave art at a couple of really well-known sites. So Ruffignac, which is the Cave of 100 Mammoths, as well as Lascaux. And so one of the things that I want to emphasize here is, oh yeah, you told me to point it over there. I didn't listen. Okay, there we go. Yeah, and so kind of thinking about the creatures on these cave walls that appear there. And sort of how prehistoric peoples were making sense of them, what they were doing with them. Who cares about cave art? Great question. I teach film. Why are we talking about cave paintings? Well, Picasso, for one, cares about cave art. Upon visiting Lascaux in 1940 and observing its art, he remarked, "We have learnt nothing." Who else cares about Stone Age art? Well, most people of the Stone Age. Cave art's the main form of art practiced throughout the vast majority of human history and also Neanderthal history. Conventions of cave paintings endured 4 times as long as all of recorded history. So by comparison, all other art is a blip on the radar. Judith Thurman says, Paleolithic artists were transmitting their techniques from generation to generation for 25 millennia with almost no innovation or revolt. For the conventions of cave painting to have endured 4 times as long as recorded history, the culture it served must have been deeply satisfying and stable to a degree that it is hard for modern humans to imagine. John Green, in his book The Anthropocene Reviewed, points out that despite the social labor time necessary, both to secure food and to avoid the dangers posed by the non-human environment in the Paleolithic era, prehistoric humans, quote, made time to create art almost as if art isn't optional for humans. And lastly, who cares about cave art? Well, directly making the connection to cinema, how I kind of got interested in thinking about this stuff was through Werner Herzog, the new German cinema director, noted documentarian. He made his only venture into 3D, a 3D documentary called Cave of Forgotten Dreams that goes to Chauvet Cave and goes to great lengths to show his perspective on the artwork there, and specifically this idea that cave art is a sort of proto-cinema, so that cave art is sort of a precursor to cinema. It's an earlier attempt to create the illusion of images in motion, an attempt to capture change over time visually. So as we see here, this is an example from Chauvet Cave, and conventional understanding of this was that this is just a group of rhinoceroses. Is that how you pluralize rhinoceros? I don't know, it is now. But Herzog points out, and I think correctly, that another way of interpreting this would be as one rhinoceros in motion. Right? This is an okay example of this. I think a better example is probably here, also from Chauvet. We see a cave lion And it looks here like the head is kind of pointed down, and here that the head's kind of pointed straight forward. Right here that we might not have 4 separate cave lions, but perhaps 1 cave lion in motion. And if that's not compelling enough on its own, which certainly it might not be, we've got to think about the source of illumination for these things. So what is making vision possible in these caves? Well, they're dark. People aren't living in them for the most part because they're dark. And to get light, you need fire, and fire creates carbon monoxide. And carbon monoxide kills you if you're sitting in a cave burning a bunch of stuff and inhaling carbon monoxide. So prehistoric peoples mostly didn't live in caves. If they did, they lived kind of in the very opening section of it. But like Rufignac that we went to, you've got to go almost a mile into that cave system before you see any of the artwork there at all. So people are kind of choosing to venture into these dark and often dangerous spaces, doing so by lamplight and torchlight. And of course, that's how they would have been seeing the images on the cave walls as well. So lit by lamps and torches, their pictures would have presented a flickering, unreachable spectacle to whoever peered up, a Paleolithic equivalent to our present-day experiences of the cinema screen. Bell continues, darkness encourages dreaming. In the torch's flicker, living shapes would loom up, and it was all one, whether they stemmed from the mind or the rock. Imagination was nature, and vice versa. So we're kind of blurring the boundaries here, or really predating the boundaries, between having a clear boundary between the human mind and the external world, in this case, the world of animals. Other examples from Chauvet, and just to kind of add one more wrinkle into this idea of cave art as proto-cinema, we can also take into account the cave wall itself and how it kind of undulates. These caves are not perfectly flat, perfectly smooth. They have lots of variability in their surfaces, and often the artists are using those surfaces to kind of create an illusion of motion through this as well. The implied motion introduced by the cave wall and its relationship to the image. Again, we're talking about images that would have been lit by torches or stone lamps, burning animal fat. The flicker from those specifically is going to be capable of creating a stronger illusion of motion. Asma and Revere in their study said an 8-legged bison drawn in Chauvet Cave proves that split action movement by superimposition was already used from the Aurignacian. This graphic illusion achieves its full impact when the light from a grease lamp or torch is moved along the length of the rock wall. In Lascaux, one of the sites that we were able to visit, has the most of these early animations. In France, there are 53 figures in 12 caves that represent movement using superimposition, and the majority of those are in Lascaux. Okay, cool. I get the cinema part, but horror? Glad you asked. So, one way of thinking about the possibility of horror here is this is not really a commonly accepted theory for what early prehistoric humans would have been doing with their cave art. There's lots of different theories, but I think this is kind of one that there's ample evidence for, and at least as much evidence for as a lot of these other theories. So one thing to think about here is the earliest examples of cave art focused on apex predators, so cave lions, mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, cave bears, things that are dangerous, that can tear you apart. And often these cave bears are actually the ones living in these caves. I think it was in Lascaux, maybe it was Chauvet. They found over 150 bear skeletons, so not just a rarity, right, that you encounter a bear in these spaces. So first, focus on apex predators and coexistence with apex predators, right? You're having to get closer to these actual apex predators to see these images. Then later we have kind of horses, bison, aurochs, ibex, things like that. These become prevalent later on as climate change reduced the numbers of larger animals, eventually to extinction. One theory is that these are kind of informational pictures, right? Pictures that are showing you things that you can kill to eat. But that theory's largely been disproven because the sorts of things we see, the sorts of animals we see represented in a lot of these, almost all of these cave paintings, have really no correlation with the fauna that would have been consumed by people living in the area at the time. So they don't really correlate, right? So it seems unlikely that they're just drawing the stuff that they're eating. For example, fishes are largely absent even from places where fish would have been a large part of the diet. One other thing that is rare, if not entirely missing, in these cave images is the human figure. So these are animals, almost always. Very few examples of landscapes. I can think of one, and it's from Chauvet. Very few examples of the human figure, and when we do see the human figure, it is often in this kind of frightening hybrid form, right, where we kind of see the legs and feet and hands and arms of a human, the genitals of maybe a human, I don't know. Horse's tail, probably horse's body, owl's face, bison's beard, antlers, perhaps of a deer or elk. This is called the Sorcerer, and this is an example from Trois-Fléaux in France. Probably the most famous example of a hybrid. You could see how it would strike fear into those looking at it. Just another quick example. This is from Gabillou, bison-headed human figure. In this case, that appears to be shot through with spears or arrows. And possibly the most famous example, my favorite example, the Birdman of Lascaux. So, you'll notice the figure itself is not quite a stick figure, but almost, certainly compared to the rhinoceros and bison over here, right? It's a much more minimalistic art style. And again, we have the hybrid, right? So we have, it's a person, a man, but with the head of a bird, and it has this bird on a staff, so perhaps it's a shaman or some sort of priestly figure. And in the scene, we've got a bison also that has been shot or stabbed with some spears. That seems to be kind of trampling this person to their death. The most interesting thing to me about this is not only that this is the only human figure in Lascaux, but where it appears. It appears at the bottom of a shaft, kind of like a well, pretty narrow, that's 17 feet deep. And this shaft is kind of off to the side of the cave. So you kind of go into the main hall of the cave, and there's most of these paintings on the walls. You kind of go off to the side, go all the way to the end of that side section, and then all the way down 17 feet. They would have had to build a ladder or scaffold or something to get in and out of that space. And only by going down 17 feet into the ground can you actually see this figure. So certainly, again, kind of thinking about danger that would have been present simply to encounter these artworks, much less to make them in the first place. I think a core point here is to kind of get at what this shaft Birdman might be doing. And one interpretation is this right here. So, stalking death into memory. This is what human knowledge was experimenting with. And one can thus read this shaft scene as the expression of an important step in human self-awareness. They continue, the interpretation that orients the shaft scene toward a mythical narrative is enriched by associating it to the two back-to-back bison at the end of the nave. The nave's the kind of main section in Lascaux. These representations were both executed on a similar support of gold-yellow calcite. In both cases, these scenes are located at two places in the cave that mark the boundary of two visual groups. On the one hand, a world that can be controlled, where man has left many traces, and on the other hand, a world beyond, a world that is dangerous and impenetrable. So here we have art functioning as a social tool for transgressing beyond the boundaries of the known, the boundaries of the safe, the boundaries of the controllable. I kind of mentioned this just in passing a second ago, but it's worth emphasizing here. When we see these cave paintings there's Lascaux, there's Chauvet, Rouffignac is right around Lascaux. Altamira is also a major site in northern Spain. And you notice, most of these sites are in northern Spain, southern France, right along the edge of what would have been a layer of permafrost that covered most of Europe. As this layer of permafrost receded, humans are kind of coming up into Europe, or Cro-Magnon, early humans, are kind of coming up into Europe, settling in these places, following the animals that are grazing in these places. Of course, mammoths ultimately die off as we enter an interglacial period where the glaciers are receding, things are warming up, so this permafrost recedes, this blue line represents glaciers. So this is all solid ice covered. And so as the climate's changing kind of on its own, warming up through the last ice age, this interglacial period basically prompts, or it makes it possible for people to inhabit this area in the first place, and then also to kind of chronicle what's happening with animal life in those places. And just one other brief example here, not all of these examples are in Europe. This one is from Sago Canyon, Utah. This was made around the time when temperatures were kind of rising, humidity was kind of drying out, and so that was sort of responsible for sparking this change of animal migration patterns, and therefore also the hunting patterns and life patterns of the humans that live there. And this is an example of canyon art, not cave art, because it's not a cave, it's a canyon, but still, same idea. And here also you can sort of see little holes in the chest, some of these have holes in the head area. That kind of points us a pretty direct clue at what these might have been used for. Those holes in the head and heart, right, might indicate they were used for target practice. So there's a sort of instrumental value that these things have as tools for training in that case. But also, I think that active target practice functions as a really good metaphor for what horror does in general and what these images are doing then as well, right? It's sort of allowing people to collectively bring perceived threats or objects of fear under their control, and to do that affectively, kind of emotionally in the moment of viewing, and perhaps to carry that with them beyond the act of viewing. So, why horror then or now? That pretty much gets to it, right? But there are a few different accounts that have been proposed to explain the allure of horror, why anybody is drawn to this kind of stuff in the first place. Scholars have speculated that horror offers an opportunity for confronting one's repressed desires, in some cases, for engaging in social displays of normative behavior, right? What is it acceptable to do? What do you get punished for doing? What do you get rewarded for doing? For engaging in benign masochism, so hurting ourselves just a little bit in a way that doesn't cause any enduring pain or injury. Or for satisfying a curiosity about category-violating monsters and suspenseful plots. Other theories, more recent theories coming out of psychology, suggest that one use of horror might be flexing our empathy muscles, so kind of giving us practice, right? Seeing other people in danger and practicing caring about them, identifying with them. One study even went so far as to suggest that horror can function as a kind of exposure therapy, right? So where you're kind of introduced, if you're afraid of spiders, definitely afraid of spiders, you might first be shown a picture of one, and then maybe asked to enter a room where there's one in a terrarium on the opposite side of the room, but you don't have to go anywhere near it, right? And then gradually getting that exposure closer and closer, right, to actually just existing around the spider. Same kind of thing with horror, right? It kind of can help us practice better adapting, better coping with traumas, fears, and things of that nature. So in 2020, a psychology study found that horror fans were actually more psychologically resilient and prepared during the early days of the pandemic. They said this is consistent with the hypothesis that exposure to frightening fictions allows audiences to practice effective coping strategies that can be beneficial in real-world situations. And I want to emphasize, I think the collective piece here is key, right? Collective viewing is what makes cinema cinema. It's why we consider the dawn of cinema to be 1895, when the first films were projected on a wall for an audience. Edison's peep shows already existed. You could already go and just by yourself and watch a film, but to kind of view it collectively is important. I think that's also key, as we saw with Stone Age art. I think it's particularly important when we're talking about horror, because horror can also facilitate social bonding through common dislikes, which when discovered, studies have shown, lead people to feel more favorably toward one another than they would if they discovered shared likes. So shared dislikes, in this study at least, were found to be more powerful than shared likes. Bonding over something frightening, something you see in a horror film, something you don't like, right, might be even more powerful than bonding over shared likes. They said discovering a shared negative attitude about a target person predicted liking for a stranger more strongly than discovering a shared positive attitude. Presumably, sharing negative attitudes is alluring in part because it establishes in-group, out-group boundaries. So again, we have the notion of horror kind of being wrapped up with notions of boundaries, mental boundaries, right? The projection of imagination onto a cave wall, social boundaries in terms of in-group, out-group, who belongs, that kind of thing. Noel Carroll theorizes horror and kind of has a couple of powerful ideas. He's kind of building on David Hume's theories of tragedy, and he says, it is not that we crave disgust, but that disgust is the predictable concomitant of disclosing the unknown. The horror fiction has at the center something which is given as in principle unknowable. So in other words, we don't seek the horror itself. The horror is just the thing that we kind of have to deal with in order to get these more productive things that come out of dealing with the unknown, dealing with things that prompt fear. Carroll continues, the imagery of horror fiction seems to be necessarily repulsive, and yet the genre has no lack of consumers. Like other forms of tragedy, works of horror fiction are both repulsive and attractive. One potential explanation for this puzzle is that audiences can experience all the terror of horrifying situations with none of the personal risk. The emotion is detached from reality. Works of horror are constructed in a way to engage other emotions in addition to fear and disgust, namely fascination with the imagery and plot structures that surround those fearful elements. And just to kind of emphasize, right, for the book project that we're working on, we're especially interested in horror as a way of mediating between humans and our environments, our non-human environments, the natural world. Environmental threats are the ones that our analysis focuses on. Horror functions as a tool for giving structures to fears and creating affective pathways that might allow us to collectively bring those fears under control or not. And Mark Bold, in his book, The Anthropocene Unconscious, has what I found to be a particularly a provocative but also quite useful claim when he asks, what happens if we stop assuming a text is not about climate change? Okay, we're almost to actual film, halfway through. I do want to take one other detour, though, through 1816, The Year Without a Summer. The Year Without a Summer is a really clear, probably the most clear-cut example of sort of interactions between climate change on the one hand and horror on the other. In 1815, Mount Tambora in Indonesia erupts, and as a result of the atmospheric dust it left behind, 1816, much of the northern hemisphere falls into a period of darkness and cold. Crops fail, there are food shortages, there are typhus epidemics, incessant rain, widespread flooding, red snow, in some cases blue snow, perpetually overcast skies, haze that doesn't dissipate. So a major kind of change to climate, albeit a temporary one, and a natural. And it's from this summer, Year Without a Summer, that two really significant horror icons come into being. Mary Shelley and Lord Byron and their kind of entourage are vacationing around Lake Geneva in Switzerland. And on a particularly cold and rainy day during the summer when they would love to be out, in the boats on the lake, they are instead stuck inside. And they decide to have a ghost story competition. Well, Mary Shelley comes up with what would become the basis of Frankenstein. And Robert Polidori takes Lord Byron's ideas and kind of melds them into a story of his own that becomes the basis for Dracula. So it's both of these figures, and again, what you can see here, are enduring in their cinematic representations as well, largely due to 1931's universal adaptations of both of these films. But yeah, so let's jump ahead in the interest of time to horror cinema today. So over the last 10 years or so, there's been a renewed interest in horror, specifically as a genre of art film, rather than, say, just as pop culture or exploitation or mass media. This chart shows lots of different relative popularities from 1910 to it's actually been updated in 2024. And as you can see here, horror has pretty huge spike right around 2010. Sort of 1990 is kind of the lull here, and then around 2000s it's kind of picking up a little bit, and around 2010 to the 2020s it's kind of growing pretty drastic. And just to show you that more close up, this doesn't necessarily imply a correlation between the Western. In fact, I don't think there is one. I'm just showing you it so you can see the numbers. Okay, so why horror, why now? Recently, horror has become a staple of art house film. It's the bulk of what A24 produces, for example. So films like Men, Heretic, It Comes at Night, The Killing of a Sacred Deer, Under the Skin, Ty West's X trilogy, as well as Ari Aster, who we'll get to in a second, Robert Eggers, Gene Schoenbrum, also Jordan Peele's first 3 feature films, right? He gains prominence as a comedian, and then as soon as he makes his transition to feature films, he does it through the genre of horror. And as I mentioned, we'll get to Ari Aster in just a second. We'll spend the back half of the presentation kind of digging into his film Midsommar and kind of what it shows us, what it has to tell us about sort of fears related to the environment. But this is all kind of part of, when I say this all, Midsommar is kind of part of the new folk horror. So Robert Eggers' film The Witch and Ari Aster's Midsommar, kind of key texts in this larger movement of returning to folk horror. So here's lots of examples. And notice this is kind of a worldwide trend, right? This is not just a trend in English filmmaking or American filmmaking, but cinema across the world. And this folk horror boom was kind of foreshadowed by the remake of The Wicker Man, starring Nicolas Cage in 2006. Terrible film, you should definitely see it. And The Wicker Tree, which is an almost, 40 years late sequel to The Wicker Man. A little bit of context for what folk horror is. Well, folk horror kind of stems from 3 English films that came out in the late 60s and early 70s. So Witchfinder General in 1968, The Blood on Satan's Claw in 1971, and The Wicker Man in 1973. By the way, Christopher Lee stars as Lord Summerisle in The Wicker Man, and he said it was the best film he had ever been in. So take that for as you may. These are all very different films. These are films that are not intentionally linked. They're not intentionally building on one another. But nevertheless, they all kind of share an interest in the rural, specifically isolation and isolated communities, superstition, paganism, the supernatural, and what Bernice Murphy calls the eerie power of the natural landscape. So just to emphasize some other things that are going on in the world in the 60s and 70s, Silent Spring, Rachel Carson's book comes out in 1962, kind of a chronicle of DDT's effect on the natural world. In 1967, there's an oil spill off the coast of Cornwall, England. In 1968, the American Petroleum Institute scientists note that one of the possible sources of rising CO2 in the atmosphere is fossil fuel. Specifically, they phrase it as, none seems to fit the presently observed situation, no explanation. Seems to fit the presently observed situation as well as the fossil fuel elimination theory. That paper warns that significant rises in CO2 could melt ice caps, increase sea levels, change fish distributions, and so on. In 1969, there's an oil spill off the coast of California. But then in 1970, the EPA is created. Earth Day is created. In 1971, Greenpeace is founded. In 1972, the EPA bans DDT, the thing that Rachel Carson's book was all about. Also in 1972, there's a UN conference on the human environment in Stockholm that 113 countries attended. The world's first political parties to make environmental issues a central focus of their campaigns were formed around this time. United Tasmania Group in Australia and the Values Party in New Zealand. The Popular Movement for the Environment in Switzerland. Those are all in 1972. And then People in England in 1973, which later becomes, kind of transitions into the UK's Green Party. And in 1973, India's Chipko movement takes up literal tree hugging. If you ever heard that expression, tree hugging hippie, that's exactly where it comes from. They did tree hugging as a tactic to try to defend against widespread deforestation. So all of that is to suggest this is kind of a worldwide trend and worldwide interest in environmental issues and dealing with environmental issues, kind of birth of the modern mass environmental movement. And it's kind of coinciding with these folk horror films, the Unholy Trinity, the original, as it were, in folk horror. Okay, so let's fast forward to a couple years ago. Ari Aster's 2019 film, Midsommar. It opens in this cold, desolate world. We don't see any signs of life. We see several signs of the natural world, the environment. Eventually we're introduced to our main characters. Danny, sort of our protagonist, and her boyfriend Christian, who's kind of a real asshole. And to put it as briefly as we can, but basically he's kind of come to the conclusion that he's going to break up with her. He just hasn't gotten around to doing it yet. His friends are always pestering him to break up with her. Why haven't you broken up with her yet? But then one day, her sister kills her parents and kills herself, using car exhaust, by the way. And so Danny kind of falls into this deep grief that ultimately exacerbates their relationship problems, but also puts Christian in a spot where he feels like he can't really break up with her, right? He kind of gets, the worst thing of the murder-suicide is, he kind of gets stuck with this girl he doesn't really want to be with. And so, long story short, she goes to this party with him. At the party, she finds out that he has been planning to go on a trip to Sweden, where they're going to live for like 6 weeks, and he's leaving in like a 2 weeks. So it's right around the corner. She had no idea what was happening, and he kind of drops that on her, and as a way of trying to save face, invites her to come along on the trip, being certain that in her grief and devastation, she's never going to go. Right? Well, she does go. She accepts the offer, much to the chagrin of Christian and his friends. They go to Sweden, and you get this really incredible tracking shot where the camera tracks up until we're all the way rotated 180 degrees, right? We get this crossing of the threshold, blurring of boundaries, right, between the familiar world of Danny's life in the States and this unfamiliar world of Sweden. The world is turned upside down, literally, visually, just as her world had been turned upside down, metaphorically. And then they're ultimately welcomed to this community called Harga, where you get a bunch of people kind of, sort of like a back to the land kind of thing. They all kind of live in peace with the natural world, and it seems to be this place of abundance that they're kind of all welcomed into. Christian and his friends are all grad students in anthropology, so they are going there because they're interested in studying this community and sort of their rituals and their folk life and things like that. A lot of things happen, but one of the key things, Danny ultimately is crowned the May Queen at this big May Day festival and celebration that they have. And she sort of fits in a way that none of the others do, in large part because the people of Harga experience grief and try to treat grief collectively. So here, where she's wailing in sorrow, all of the other women of the village gather around her and start wailing as well. So you get this kind of collective scream, right? This community grieving. And it's especially important because community is something that has been taken away from Danny, right? With the death of her family. And community is something that Christian is clearly uninterested in providing for her or helping her cultivate in her life. Okay, so seems like a pretty good thing, right? Danny's welcomed by this group of back-to-the-landers. Everything seems fine, right? She's kind of working through her grief in this productive, pro-social way. But this is a society that believes in human sacrifice. Specifically, when you turn 72 in this society, you get up on this cliff and you jump off. This sort of ritual suicide is seen as a beautiful thing to the people of Harga. It's seen as the kind of natural conclusion of the life cycle. They have life in 4 seasons, where you kind of progress through each of those seasons, and then culminating with death at age 72. So, with this introduction, we kind of get one of the major themes of the film, although it's one that was kind of ignored in a lot of the reviews that came out at the time. This theme of ecofascism. Eugenics, in particular, right? We get eugenics with human sacrifice here. Also, one by one, all of Danny's friends get killed off. I guess Christian's friends, technically. Get killed off by the villagers for various reasons, some clearer than others. And we also see that one of the guys in the friend group's name is Pele. His brother lives in Harga, and he has also brought some of his friends to Harga for this celebration. And the friends that he brought are both South Asian. One of Christian's friends is black, and that's important because those are the first characters killed off. And in particular, the friends that Pele's brother brings are really, really, I think appropriately unnerved by this ritual of the Atastupa, jumping off of the cliff. They're yelling, they're asking, like, how could you do this? They kind of make a big show of how terrible this thing is and why people seem to be just accepting it. And so, of course, they must be marked for death. So yeah, they're kind of killed off one by one in all kinds of different gruesome and horrific ways that I won't show. So, what's the connection here to ecofascism? Let's dig into that a little bit more before we get back to the film. So environmental historian Michael Zimmerman calls ecofascism a totalitarian government that requires individuals to sacrifice their interests to the well-being of the land, understood as the splendid web of life or the organic whole of nature, including peoples and their states. Ecofascism poses a real-world threat even today. So two fairly recent mass killings, both attributed, the shooters in both cases attributed their motivation to ecofascism. So the 2019 El Paso shooter cited his hatred of immigrants, overpopulation, and environmental degradation as motivations behind his fury in an online post. And the Christchurch shooter in New Zealand, who also killed people in 2019, had declared himself explicitly as an eco-fascist and blamed high immigrant birth rates on his need to kill. Of course, there's a longer history here too. It's not just 2019, right? This stuff didn't come out of nowhere. In Ecofascism, Lessons from the German Experience, two scholars say that the Nazi ecology, so the Third Reich conventional Nazi ecology, was linked to traditional agrarian and romanticism and hostility to urban civilization. And ecological ideas for the Third Reich were an essential element of racial rejuvenation. You see this also in the Nazi slogan, blood and soil, right? As well as the larger kind of push toward celebrating the rural, returning to the land, returning to traditional ways of life, things like that. And even before that, we kind of get a joining of hands of environmentalism and what we might call proto-fascism. Julia Scott from the Daughters of the American Revolution at the National Conservation Congress of 1910 urged attendees not only to protect flora and fauna, but to conserve, quote, the supremacy of the Caucasian race in our land. So there's this very clear ideas about who this land is for, right? What this land is for. You can get a sense of the centrality of eugenics theory early on in the movement. Madison Grant's one early environmentalist who we can thank for helping save the American bison, the bald eagle, pronghorn antelope, all kinds of other species. But Grant also campaigned for the racist Emergency Quota Act of 1921 and the Immigration Restriction Act of 1924, and wrote the best-selling book called The Passing of the Great Race, or The Racial Basis of European History, which is an impassioned defense of white supremacy that Hitler later described as his personal Bible. And then just kind of fast-forwarding a little bit, Jeff Sparrow in 2019 says, it is not difficult to imagine eco-authoritarianism, or what Naomi Klein calls climate barbarianism, a politics centered around the state making our way of life, quote unquote, endure or appear sustainable as the environment around it disintegrates. Future governments, Sparrow says, future governments committed to this project will be able to draw upon the vast array of coercive powers they've acquired over the past decades, draconian anti-protest laws, secret trials and imprisonment, the deployment of the army to quell civil disturbances, and so on. And we get eugenics in the film not just at the level of human sacrifice, but also at the level of reproduction, kind of planning. So all pairings, all romantic pairings, all breeding basically has to be approved by the elders of Harga. Coincidentally, even though we do see members of Harga going abroad to bring their friends back, they're occasionally bringing back black and brown people, coincidentally, none of those have seemed to factor into the population of Harga, because all of the Harga people we see are white. But sometimes outsiders, like in this case Christian, are permitted to breed with the locals. After all, they have to kind of get their gene pool mixed up a little bit, right? Every once in a while, however, they do permit two Hargas to have a child together because they're intentionally trying to create someone with physical and mental deformities who they can use as their prophet to interpret their holy text. So eugenics on both levels, right? Kind of who's not permitted to breed or intermarry, and sometimes who is, in order to have preferred outcomes for the elders. And we also see some of these things, on the surface, although you might have to read Swedish to make sense of it, but pretty front and center in the film. So as they're first getting to Sweden, before they've arrived at Harga, they encounter this banner that in Swedish says, "Stop mass migration to Hälsingland, vote for a free North this fall." Again, this is also emphasizing that these tendencies are not unique just to the Harga. Runes are also a key notion of this. Not that runes are inherently fascist or eco-fascist, but they sure are in this film, the way they're used here. Early in the film, before we know how dangerous Pele is, that he's going to kind of help his friends be ritually sacrificed, we briefly see a book on the coffee table in his apartment called The Secret Nazi Language of the Uthark. It's a blink and you'll miss it detail. Even those who catch it might have no cause for concern. After all, Pele and his friend group are anthropologists, right? They might have a pretty good reason for reading a book called that. However, in the director's cut, it also is emphasized further in this scene where Josh is holding it on his lap in their car ride in Sweden. How do runes come into play in Harga? Well, they're used pretty widely, right? Carved into rocks, carved into texts, sewn into garments. And here we see this table for ritual meals, kind of laid out as a way of organizing the community. So the table here is arranged in the shape of an Othala. This rune has been used by Nazis and neo-Nazis to refer to the Aryan race. Multiple divisions of the Third Reich military used it in that context, including the badge of the SS Race and Settlement Main Office. It's also been used in South Africa's Boermag and White Liberation Movement there as well. The Christchurch shooter used it, and it can be seen today on the flags of the American National Socialist Movement. Okay. Christian, I think, is a particularly important figure here in kind of pointing us to one of the main takeaways from the film, which is kind of the limits of liberalism, the limits of open-mindedness, right? Well, he says, right, after watching the Atastupa, the people jumping from the cliffs, he says, that was really, really shocking. I'm trying to keep an open mind. So there's this idea that you must, especially as a grad student, right, especially as an intellectual, as a person of knowledge, right, you must understand all the nuance and history and traditions that kind of go into these terrible, horrible, human-destroying things. I won't get too much into this, so I want to leave plenty of time for Q&A, but we see here on Elder Siv's robe, also a rune. Eric Hobsbawm talks about the invention of tradition, and I think the Harga show us this to a T, right? Hobsbawm says, the invention of tradition is things that appear or claim to be old, but are actually quite recent in origin and sometimes invented wholesale. There have been some fan theories about how this factors into Midsommar. In particular, this ritual sacrifice that we see at the end of the film, if we assume that the events of the film take place in 2018, 2019, around the time it came out, the sacrifice ritual, the elders tell us, happens every 90 years. If that's the case, then the preceding sacrifice must have happened in the late 1920s. Coincides pretty neatly with the rise of fascism in Sweden. The National Socialist Freedom League in Sweden is established in 1924. The Swedish National Socialist Farmers and Workers' Party is established in 1926. The Swedish Fascist People's Party is also in 1926, along with its paramilitary wing. In 1930, there's a group called the New Swedish People's League that kind of splits from their primary organization and becomes the main player in town. And then in 1931, you have fascists standing for office for the first time in Sweden. So it kind of coincides with this larger, cultural, historical mood that's going on in Sweden at the time. And back to the idea of the invention of tradition, that 1920 sacrifice must also have been the very first sacrifice, not this ancient tradition like the Harga wants you to think, because Elder Futhark was not deciphered until 1865. So they wouldn't have had the language they needed to conduct the rituals that they're conducting prior to that. Right? So we have this invented tradition. Skip ahead. One last example of kind of invented traditions, and I didn't want to show you the actual example from the movie because it's quite graphic. But this thing called the Blood Eagle. It's this Viking, or not, depending on who you read, ritual where basically the person would be cut open, their ribs broken, and then their lungs kind of taken out their back and folded up to look sort of like eagle wings. You can correct me here, but what I read is there are only 2 instances of this in actual Viking literature, and it's unclear if both or either of them actually refer to anything historically that happened. It could just be fiction. But even if we accept that these happened twice, right, we see them kind of being taken up and used as a ritual as though it were something that happened all the time and must continue to happen. All right. In the interest of time, we'll skip ahead. Whoops, he doesn't have anything to do with this, does he?
Certainly fits the horror thing.
Absolutely. I think it fits a number of themes. Also, Elder Siv mentions, she draws our attention to this environmental context as well. And she says, well, poetry, that it's now the hottest and brightest summer on record when they're repeating this 90 years bloodletting ritual. Right? So that it does kind of come through on its surface here as well. And kind of the most important thing that's going on in this film, I think, relative to its mediations of the environment and ecofascism, is the way it brings the audience along for the ride. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of reviews, most reviews at the time the film came out, kind of treated this as a happy ending, uncritically as a happy ending. At the end, Danny sees Christian and several other people being burned alive, and finally she smiles for the first time forever. She's found her people, she's found her community, she's found a place where she belongs, she's been able to work through grief, and we are happy for her. A lot of critics at the time, reviewers, suggested we should be happy for her. But, of course, this ending really implicates us, the viewer, right, for having gone along with this eco-fascist project of eugenics and extermination. So, Danny smiles at the audience smiles with her, she has been brainwashed, and we go along with her brainwashing because we share her intense dislike of her boyfriend. Real quickly, by way of wrapping up, one thing that Midsommar shares with lots of other new folk horror films is this notion that the ultimate thing to be feared is ourselves, and how easily we go along with, in the example of Midsommar, how easily we go along with Danny on her journey of trauma, grief, and rebirth, how desperately we crave community, and the things we're willing to overlook at best or participate in at worst in order to gain some semblance of community. how eager we are to tie ourselves in knots trying to justify destructive, inhumane, violent, fundamentally unjust cultural practices, sometimes through willful ignorance, here Danny, sometimes through an overabundance of rationalization, here Josh, the friend that knows everything, right, is so smart that he has something to say, right, about everything, has a way of intellectually justifying pretty much everything. And sometimes through the upholding of tradition, or quote-unquote tradition, as a virtue in itself, which Pele does here, as his brother is one of the final sacrifices, and he kind of goes along with that, upholding and placing the value of tradition over the value of his own brother's life. One of the links I want to make here to climate change today is that unlike the kind of birth of the modern environmental movement that we were seeing in the 60s and responses to it, here we seem to be pulling away altogether from even pretending to try to do something about the issue. Right? And pulling back from what few things were in place, right? So there's the kind of growing awareness of these issues and their seriousness, but business interests and government interests kind of working in the wrong direction here. Again, this is kind of a tendency of something that's not just unique to Midsommar, but part of a larger tendency in folklore. We get kind of a similar arc with the father in The Witch, who's such a zealot that he can't even get along with his 1600s New England Puritan neighbors, and has to move his family to what they see as the edge of civilization, kind of the edge of the woods outside of town. And he's kind of dealing with all these fears of supernatural threats, but in the process, that move and his relationship to his family throughout that move, he becomes the one that is terrorizing, that is doing harm, that is doing violence in some cases to his other family members, posing them the most direct threat. And lastly, most recent example, 28 years later, sort of plays with, it's not a folklore film in the strictest sense, but it does play with a lot of folklore conventions. And I think something it does that's really important here is that in 28 Days Later, the first film in this trilogy, it feels almost inevitable that the world is going to end. But in 28 years later, things have more or less settled into a relatively stable rhythm. So the world is not ending. It's just kind of continuing to sputter along in a pretty diminished way. In fact, we learn early on in the film that most of the world is fine. Most countries outside the UK were able to control the spread of rage virus that turns people into fast-moving zombies. Most of the rest of the world has it contained, but the UK hasn't gotten that figured out yet. It's severely damaged as a society. People must substantially rearrange their lives, their communities, to cope with said damage. And it's of such scale that returning to normal would be not just impossible, but unthinkable. This split between the UK and the rest of the world also emphasizes the way the impacts of climate change today, right? Including the growing prevalence of contagious diseases, and the way that these things impact human societies unevenly, right? So we do not all feel the same effects at the same moment. The challenge then is to make sense of this monster, the monster of climate change, that unlike cave bears or stampeding bison or zombies or Draculas, does not fit neatly into a mortal body that can be shot or stabbed or speared to death. Right? How then do we defeat a monster that seems to be everywhere and yet nowhere in particular, especially one that is fed not only by governments and private businesses and the sort of powers that be, but also by our own habits and rhythms of everyday life. All right, we'll end there. We've got just a few minutes for Q&A. You've got questions, I've got answers. Yeah.
I hope you got answers. So, interestingly, I was thinking, I know in cinema, certainly the Viking series, there were a couple episodes of people being bloodied, for which at least me and probably other people who watched that it was a good thing. I mean, clearly it was a good thing, because it was perpetrated upon what we assume were evil people. When you mentioned not much in the record of Viking literature, I'm assuming you mean the sagas.
Yes.
And do you think, if in fact it was more prevalent during that time, why would they have, the writers, well after the fact, who wrote the sagas, have downplayed it? Or what made it, why did we turn it into something more than what it apparently was?
Yeah, I think that really gets back to Hobsbawm's idea of the invention of tradition. This is a thing that happens fairly often with a lot of cultural artifacts that we might not expect. And I think that's one example where we're kind of seeing one thing and assuming because it happened in the past that it must have happened fairly often in the past or fairly regularly in the past in a way that may not necessarily be untrue, but does seem to be unsubstantiated. Right? So we're kind of assuming that this thing was maybe much more popular than it actually was in reality. In the case of Midsommar, we see very clearly how they're using it, right, to just reinforce their power over the non-Harga people that are coming to visit. And I think that's the way it functions in reality a lot as well, right? Kind of useful to the powers that be, right? It's useful for somebody for this to become a thing that we kind of accept as a general tradition, as the way things have always kind of been. Yeah.
I have a question on how would you, with the context of your arguments using the way, make space for French New Extremity or some of the body horror films concerning the viewer's need to make sense of boundary transgressions in horror cinema?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. New French Extremity in particular, and body horror we get into in a lot more detail in the book, but there it's the boundaries of the physical body that are breaking down. And very often those films are not interested in the sort of intellectual discussion of these kind of big picture issues that concern us, right? They're much more interested in the immediate, visceral, kind of embodied response that we have to seeing something gross or terrifying or inhuman. So I think it's kind of acting on us and acting on our bodies in a way that's different from the sort of folk horror, new folk horror in particular, but still getting at it, as your question kind of said, getting at that breakdown of boundaries, right? Understanding the boundary between ourselves and the outside world, right? Between my blood is something that goes inside and something to be splattered all over the screen, right? Where that boundary breaks down and breaks down repeatedly as a way of kind of getting us to confront our own worst fears, our own worst traumas. Any other questions? We've got a couple minutes. Yeah.
Great job, thanks.
Oh, thank
In addition to the other purposes to which horror has been put, you speculated about the need to sort of inure ourselves to potentially catastrophic things and a couple of, in these more modern instances, is horror in any of the literature used as a ideological cudgel, or, I mean, I can't imagine that Ari Aster is trying to make some critique of environmentalism in making Midsommar, but I can certainly see how some viewers might take it as, oh, these crazy environmentalists. Is that anywhere in literature that horror can be used as a ideological statement or weapon?
Yeah, definitely, and in some cases it's done in ways that sort of reinforce the powers that be, and in some cases it's done in ways that undercut that, but yeah, especially like exploitation cinema, slashers, things like that, tend to be very interested in reinforcing the status quo, ideological status quo, showing what behaviors, what sorts of interactions, what sorts of people deserve to be punished or exterminated, which kinds of people deserve to escape unscathed or saved at the end. So yeah, but it's there, but it doesn't necessarily cut in a particular ideological direction, right? It can also be used to kind of undercut or make, sort of pointed critiques of those same power structures. Yeah. All right, well, happy to talk about this further with any of you if you feel like it, but that concludes today's Fourth Monday. Thank you so much for coming, and have a good rest of your day.